tariff wars? They're not just a modern thing, they're part of a bigger story. But Southeast Asia was fighting them long before the word economics even existed. Most people assume ancient kingdoms traded spices, sailed ships, and lived in peaceful isolation. They don't realize these kingdoms imposed tariffs so sophisticated they controlled entire oceans. They don't realize ports didn't just welcome merchants, they regulated, taxed, and weaponized them. And they never learned the contradiction at the center of Southeast Asian history. Trade created these kingdoms, but tariffs decided which one survived. You won't believe what you're about to see. Welcome to the Wealth Timeline, where money, power, and history quietly shape the world around us. Because the story of Southeast Asia isn't just about kings or spices. It's about economic engineering, centuries before economists. And it begins on waters that carried half the world's wealth. Picture the 10th century Malacca Strait, a narrow corridor of water, calm on the surface, but beneath it flowed the trade of China, India, and the Middle East. Ceramic jars, Persian glassware, Indian cotton, and Chinese silks passed through like clockwork. No kingdom here had a large standing army. No kingdom controlled thousands of miles of land. Instead, wealth came from a simple idea. If you control the choke point, you control the trade. And if you control the trade, you control the world around you. At the time, this seemed reasonable. What no one noticed was the cost. The earliest master of this idea was the Srivijaya Empire in Sumatra, rising around the 7th century. Srivijaya didn't conquer vast territories. It conquered roots. Its leaders understood something radical. Chinese merchants needed spices. Indian traders needed gold. Arab and Persian ships needed safe harbors. And all of them had to pass through these waters. So Srivijaya introduced a system that would redefine Southeast Asia. Harbor taxes, pilotage fees, storage tariffs, and exclusive trading rights. Decision makers at the time believed this would create order. By centralizing tariffs, Srivijaya promised protection, predictability, and stability. One assumption guided them, recorded in Chinese diplomatic records. Control of the passage equals control of the profit. But this assumption would later prove dangerous. It worked, but only under conditions that would not last. Through the 8th to 11th centuries, Srivijaya's system expanded. Its port cities became hubs where merchants exchanged currency, converted cargo, and paid standardized duties. The benefits were real. Safer seas, stable pricing, flourishing urban centers, growing Buddhist institutions funded by trade levies. The more Srivijaya taxed, the more legitimate it became. But every success came with an unintended consequence. The fixed tariffs that initially attracted merchants gradually became leverage, a way to pressure competitors and impose unequal duties on rivals. Srivijaya used tariff exemptions to reward allies, and increased fees on kingdoms that challenged its monopoly. A temporary solution for revenue became a long-term system of economic control. And the wealth that poured into Palembang made other kingdoms quietly uneasy. The stronger Srivijaya became, the harder it was to stop. The first signs of strain didn't come from within. They came from the region's rising powers. Chola India, under Rajendra Chola the Firmer, had expanding ambitions. In 1025 CE, after years of increasing Srivijayan tariffs on foreign ships, the Cholas launched a naval campaign. It wasn't about territory. It was about breaking Srivijaya's trade chokehold. Meanwhile, on the mainland, kingdoms like Khmer Angkor and Pagan began taxing their own river trade, creating competing revenue centers. By the 13th century, new coastal kingdoms, Majapahit in Java and Champa in modern Vietnam, challenged Srivijaya versus old model. Warnings emerged. More kingdoms demanding tariffs, shifting trade routes, Chinese merchants increasingly preferring direct voyages. But Srivijaya doubled down on the same strategy. Raise fees, protect monopoly. Nothing collapsed, and that was the problem. The system was still functioning, just more brittle than anyone realized. The moment everything changed came in the early 15th century with the rise of the Malacca Sultanate. Malacca made a decision that looked small at the time, but it rewired the entire trading world. They slashed tariffs for most merchants. Chinese traders documented the difference. Indian merchants wrote letters about it. Arab travelers recorded it in travelogues. Srivijaya's model was built on extraction. Malacca's model was built on attraction. Its leaders believed that predictable, low, transparent duties would bring in more ships, and more ships meant more revenue, even at lower rates. This seemed reasonable. It even seemed fair. But from that point on, the outcome was no longer optional. Merchants altered routes, harbors emptied. Malacca exploded into prosperity. Srivijaya's centuries-old tariff empire could not compete. The shift was immediate and measurable. Winners. Malacca gained global relevance in a single generation. Merchants enjoyed lower costs and safer voyages. Chinese relations deepened, reinforced by diplomatic recognition under the Ming. Losers. Older kingdoms, dependent on high tariffs, saw revenues fall. Inland empires lost control over coastal trade routes. Rival ports collapsed into irrelevance almost overnight. But the quiet shift was even bigger. Power moved from land to sea, control moved from armies to harbors, and legitimacy moved from kings to merchant communities. And once tariff competition took root, it spread. Ayutthaya adjusted its own duties to keep up. Majapahit struggled to preserve its influence. Champa and Đại Việt recalibrated their coastal laws. The region had entered a permanent era of tariff diplomacy, a world where ports negotiated power through percentages, not battles. By the 16th century, a new player arrived. The Portuguese, followed by the Dutch VOC, then the Spanish and British. Unlike earlier kingdoms, European powers had one objective: secure exclusive trading rights and enforce fixed tariffs, by force if necessary. The Portuguese seized Malacca in 1511. The VOC imposed monopolies across the Indonesian archipelago. Tariffs became political instruments, not economic negotiations. Where Southeast Asian kingdoms had balanced trade through incentives, the VOC imposed mandatory purchases, controlled pricing, specific tax contracts, exclusive access to spices. This shift had consequences. Southeast Asian kings lost flexibility, merchants lost bargaining power, and tariff wars that were once regional became global. But even here, the core incentives remained the same: control the route, control the revenue, control the world behind it. The story of Southeast Asian tariff wars isn't ancient trivia. It's a mirror, showing how economies behave when geography, incentives, and competition collide. No predictions, just patterns. When strategic choke points exist, someone will tax them. When tariffs rise too high, trade will reroute. When competitors lower costs, power shifts fast. When states rely too heavily on one revenue source, they become vulnerable to disruption. History doesn't repeat events, it repeats incentives. Here are the two takeaways. First, systems built on control last only as long as alternatives are too costly to pursue. Once a cheaper or freer option appears, even centuries-old powers collapse quietly. Second, human behavior doesn't change. From ancient Srivijaya to modern trade policy, leaders always push systems to their advantage, until the incentive structure flips. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the Wealth Timeline, and turn on the bell icon, because the next story might just change how you see power itself.